Nobody thought this year would be the one, not after 23 seasons of proving everyone wrong. But this summer, LeBron James did something he'd never done before. He left the only jersey most of us had ever pictured him in. And now, as he steps onto a new court in a new city, one question hangs over every headline. Is this the beginning of the end? The king hasn't given us an answer, and that silence is louder than anything he could have said. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why even LeBron himself doesn't seem to know how it ends.
For over 2 decades, one name has outlived every prediction made about it. LeBron James was supposed to fade, supposed to slow down, supposed to hand the game over to the next generation and step quietly into the background, the way every great athlete eventually does. Instead, he kept adding chapters nobody asked for because he refused to let time write the ending for him. By the time he reached his 40s, James had already rewritten the record books. No one had played more NBA seasons than he had, a mark he set the year before at 23 seasons, and one he kept stretching further out of reach. He'd become the league's oldest active player, a title that used to belong to men who were coaching, not competing. And somehow, at an age when most players are commentators or coaches, he was still starting games, still logging real minutes, still being talked about as a difference maker on a playoff roster. There was something almost unbelievable about it. Fans who grew up watching him as rookies were now watching him as parents, sitting next to their own kids, trying to explain how one man could still be doing this. And it wasn't just endurance, it was production. In one stretch during his final year in Los Angeles, the Lakers went 15-2 in March, with James playing 14 of those games and shooting over 56% from the field, while averaging close to 19 points, 7 assists, and 7 rebounds a night. Those aren't farewell tour numbers. Those are the numbers of a man still competing for everything. And then there was the part of the story that felt almost too poetic to be real, the sight of him sharing an NBA court with his own son. He had checked off nearly every box a career could offer, including the surreal experience of playing alongside Bronny James. For a player who had already won championships in multiple cities, who had already been called the greatest by people who'd spent their whole lives arguing about it, what was left to chase? That question followed him everywhere he went, every offseason, every early playoff exit, every time a broadcast camera lingered a little too long on his face after a loss, searching for some sign of finality. Every time his season ended, the same question resurfaced. Had the world just watched him play for the final time? He never gave a clean answer. And in the world of sports, silence like that doesn't calm speculation, it feeds it. Because when a legend refuses to say goodbye, everyone else starts saying it for him. But this year, the question stopped being hypothetical, because this year, something actually happened, something that changed the entire shape of the story. Because here's the twist nobody saw coming. The king wasn't just aging, he was about to walk away from the one thing everyone assumed was permanent.
For as long as most fans could remember, there was an unspoken assumption sitting underneath every LeBron James headline, that whenever the end finally came, it would come in Los Angeles, in purple and gold, on the same court where he'd spent nearly a decade of his career. Even the people running the franchise believed it. Lakers general manager Rob Pelinka had said publicly that he'd love for LeBron's story to end with him retiring as a Laker. It wasn't just a hope. It sounded, to most people, like a formality, a matter of when, not if. Then the ground shifted. Entering what would become his 24th NBA season, James was no longer just flirting with retirement talk in post-game pressers. He was staring down a real, structural crossroads. He was heading into the final year of his contract with the Lakers, leaving his future more uncertain than it had ever been before. This wasn't the usual offseason noise. This was a genuine fork in the road. And for the first time, retirement wasn't the only unknown on the table. Staying with the Lakers wasn't guaranteed either. And then came the moment that cracked the story wide open. Sources confirmed that James had informed the Lakers he planned to play elsewhere for the upcoming season. Read that again. Not considering, not exploring options. He told them. At 41 years old, after 9 years in Los Angeles, after building a Lakers legacy that put him in the franchise's all-time top 10 in points, assists, field goals, and three-pointers, LeBron James was choosing to leave. For a league that had spent years assuming his story had already been written, that single piece of news detonated everything. Because free agency at 41 isn't supposed to look like this. Superstars in the twilight of their careers don't usually test the market. They accept a farewell tour, a jersey retirement date, a scripted final lap around the league. LeBron James tore up that script. Instead of settling quietly into a final season with the team that helped define his legacy, he instructed his agent, Rich Paul, to talk to every team around the league that might be interested and to bring back real options. Think about what that decision actually meant. It meant the greatest longevity story in basketball history wasn't done being written. It meant a man who had already secured his place among the sport's immortals still wanted more. Not comfort, not sentiment, but competition. People close to him said that after taking time to step back and reflect, he'd concluded he still wanted to play meaningful, competitive basketball. Not a victory lap, not a ceremonial send-off. Real basketball against real stakes. But that clarity came with a cost, because somewhere in that decision was an ending. The Lakers chapter, the one so many assumed would be his last, was closing. And endings, even chosen ones, don't happen quietly. Not when they belong to LeBron James. Because leaving isn't just a business decision, not when an entire fan base built their hope around him staying. What happened next split the internet in two.
The moment the news broke, it didn't just ripple through basketball media. It detonated across every timeline, every group chat, every sports desk in the country. Because for nearly a decade, the idea of LeBron James in a Lakers jersey wasn't just a storyline. It was an assumption baked into the identity of the franchise itself. And now that assumption was gone. The speculation moved fast, and it moved everywhere. Which team could possibly convince a 41-year-old four-time champion to leave the organization he'd helped rebuild? The answer came quickly enough to shock people all over again. Sources confirmed the Golden State Warriors were one of the franchises planning to pursue him once the free agency negotiating window opened. Golden State, the team that had battled him in finals after finals, the franchise most associated with the rivalries that defined an era of his career, now positioning itself as a real threat to sign him. Think about the layers in that alone. This wasn't just business, it was personal history rewriting itself in real time. The team that had denied him championships in the past was now one of the very franchises hoping to write the final act of his career. Fans didn't know how to process it. Social media split into two camps almost instantly. One side refused to believe it, insisting this was leverage, a negotiating tactic, a way to force the Lakers to finally commit to the roster he wanted around him. The other side treated it as inevitable heartbreak, the kind of ending that great athletes are always warned about but rarely accept until it's already happening to them. And in the middle of all that noise, James himself wasn't staying silent. Just months earlier, speaking publicly, he'd pushed back hard against the entire culture of forced retirement conversations that follows aging athletes everywhere they go. In sports, there's always conversations like, when is he going to retire, he said. He needs to retire. He's this age, he's that age, but why? Why are we trying to force people still doing what they do at a high level? Why are we trying to force the narrative of, it's time to retire? Those weren't the words of a man quietly preparing to fade into the background. Those were the words of someone still fighting the assumption that time alone should decide his story. He even reached for a comparison outside of sports entirely, pointing to musicians who keep performing for as long as they want, and asking why athletes weren't given the same grace. But here's what made this moment so uniquely painful for Lakers fans specifically. It wasn't just about whether he'd keep playing. It was about where. For years, the retirement question had one comforting answer built into it. Whenever it happens, at least it'll happen here. That comfort was gone now. And the deeper into free agency the speculation went, the more it started to feel less like a hypothetical exit and more like an ending already in motion. Every insider report added another layer of tension. Every mock free agency board had his name moving between cities, and underneath it all was a quieter, sadder question that fans weren't ready to say out loud. If he really was leaving, was this actually the beginning of his goodbye tour? Nobody had an answer yet, because James hadn't given one. And that uncertainty was about to collide with something far more emotional than a business decision. Because when the goodbye finally came, it didn't arrive the way anyone expected, and it hit harder than anyone was ready for.
There's a particular kind of grief reserved for athletes who never officially say the word goodbye. They just stop showing up in the uniform you associate with them. And for Lakers fans, that moment arrived not with a press conference, not with a jersey retirement ceremony, but with a message posted online. The kind of announcement that lands in your feed before you've had time to prepare for it. James posted to social media that it was truly an honor to wear the Lakers uniform, adding that he hoped he'd made a few proud during my stint. Read those words carefully. Not, I'll always be a Laker. Not, see you soon. A stint. past tense, an acknowledgement that a chapter, one of the most decorated chapters in franchise history, had officially closed. For a fan base that had watched him carry the franchise through some of its lowest points and back into championship contention, that phrasing landed like a quiet gut punch. This was the man who arrived in Los Angeles promising to lead a rebuild, who delivered a championship in a season unlike any other in league history, who spent nearly a decade being the measuring stick every Laker roster was built around. And now, in a handful of sentences, it was over. The numbers alone tell you what was being lost. James finished his Lakers tenure ranked in the franchise's top 10 in points, assists, field goals, and three-pointers. This on a franchise with a history stretching back to some of the greatest players the sport has ever produced. That's not a role player leaving quietly through the back door. That's a legend walking out through the front, in full view, with the entire basketball world watching. And the fallout wasn't confined to fans. Inside the organization, there was a version of this ending that had clearly been hoped for and never realized. Rob Pelinka's earlier comment that he'd love for James's story to end as a Laker now read less like optimism and more like a wish that didn't survive contact with reality. Instead, the franchise was left staring at a suddenly wide-open roster picture, reportedly holding around $52 million in salary cap space to figure out its next direction without him. Money can rebuild a roster. It can't replace what James actually meant to that locker room, or to a city that had wrapped nearly a decade of basketball identity around him. And there was one more detail that made the exit even more complicated. His son Bronny wasn't accompanying him. The Lakers had chosen to fully guarantee the second-year guard's contract rather than waive him, meaning that even as the father walked out the door, part of his family was staying behind. For a man whose career had always blurred the line between basketball and legacy, between what he did and what it meant, that detail landed with its own quiet weight. He wasn't just leaving a team. He was leaving a version of his own story that had felt, for years, like the ending everyone had already written for him. The backlash wasn't loud in the way controversies usually are. There was no scandal, no villain to point at, just a slow, heavy realization settling over an entire fan base that sometimes the hardest goodbyes are the ones nobody saw coming, dressed up as a business decision. And just when it seemed like the story was heading toward retirement, towards silence, towards an ending, James did the one thing nobody expected. He chose to keep going.
This will mark his 24th NBA season and the fourth franchise of his career, joining the Cavaliers, the Heat, and the Lakers, the three teams with which he's already won championships. Think about the audacity buried inside that fact. Most players are lucky to have one franchise define their legacy. LeBron James was about to attempt to add a fourth city to a resume that already reads like basketball scripture. The terms were reported as a 2-year deal worth $8 million, with a player option attached, a contract structure that on its surface looked almost modest for a player of his stature. But that wasn't the point. The money was never the point. The structure of the deal told its own story. A player option means he's leaving the door open, giving himself the flexibility to decide year by year how much longer this goes on. And that's exactly where the biggest twist of this entire saga lives. Because even now, even after the trade rumors, even after the emotional exit from the Lakers, even after choosing a brand new team at an age when most athletes have already hung up their shoes, James still has not made a final decision about whether this will be his last season in the NBA. Read that again. He committed to playing. He committed to competing at basketball's highest level for a 24th consecutive year, but he did not commit to an ending. The retirement question that has followed him for years, the one he pushed back against at Fanatics Fest, the one reporters have asked him after every single elimination game, remains officially, deliberately unanswered. Months earlier, on the 360 with Speedy podcast, James had offered one of his most candid lines yet, acknowledging that retirement is coming, but insisting it wasn't here yet. That's the tension sitting at the center of this entire story. Not denial, not delusion, just a man who knows the end exists somewhere out there, and who has decided, for one more year at least, that it isn't going to be written on anyone else's timeline but his own. So is this really his final season? Nobody knows. Maybe not even James himself fully. What we do know is this: he chose competition over comfort, uncertainty over a scripted farewell, and a brand new challenge over a quiet goodbye tour. Whatever this season becomes, it will be entirely on his terms. And that leaves us with the only question that actually matters now. Not how his story started, but what it means when it finally does end.